Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. Today, we're joined by a very special guest, Erick Verran. Erick is the author of Obiter Dicta, published by Punctum Books in 2021, and a PhD candidate at the University of Utah. His works appeared in Game Studies, in Press Start, the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, and Postmodern Culture and the Journal of Sound and Music in Games. He also has an MFA in creative writing and poetry from the University of Florida, and he lives in Salt Lake City. And I'll also add, right, that you are a practicing poet, right, and have also,
Mhm.
I think I've told you in other contexts that you're, or rather, I've read some of your poetry reviews, and they're really good. You sort of seem to have mastered this very strange, very idiosyncratic genre of writing. So, welcome, Erick. It's
Thanks.
a pleasure to have you on, and we're really excited to chat today about, well, about your work, but also about kind of like the larger trajectory of games writing and games criticism over the past
Mhm.
20 or so years.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is great. I've been following the podcast pretty closely and been really enjoying it a lot. So um, excited to chat more.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, for generously giving your time. And I guess I'll start by asking kind of a pretty broad question that I think
Mm,
can help us sort of I think it applies both to your work, but also maybe will help be in the background or be kind of an undercurrent for our conversation a little bit, which is kind of maybe more of like a meta-critical question about how you approach writing about games. So I read a
mm,
couple of your articles, which I really enjoyed. They kind of it's the sort of writing on games that is like something I'm always looking for, but it seems kind
mm,
of difficult to find.
mm,
But one thought I had while I was reading is that a lot of writing about games that I've encountered seems to have a problem that a lot of writing or even like, in the audio form or video form about music tends to have, which is that there's this kind of problem or question of, I don't know, medium specificity, technicality, like things seem to get kind of like segmented or what's the word, compartmentalized and instrumentalized, therefore, in a critical sense.
mm,
So for example, a lot of writing about music will be just totally focused on, music theory, right? Without interrogating philosophy or theory about music. And
mm,
even when you do find writing about, music or games that does incorporate philosophy, oftentimes that philosophy is sort of in this kind of dry cut and paste way applied, right? To like sort of show that a game or a song exhibits a concept or an idea rather than allowing those two to have an encounter, right? So in my mind,
mhm,
whether we're writing about literature, painting, film, or games, alongside something like theory or philosophy, the goal should kind of always be to expand both. And I think that's something that like at least what I've read so far, you're writing and thinking about games seems like it's really
mm.
doing. So I guess that's more of a comment. I don't really have a pointed
Sure.
question here, but just if you can, speak about how you approach that, how you feel about that kind of interaction between games as a
Yeah.
medium and a kind of an external, uh, theoretical edifice.
Yeah. I mean, God, there's so much to say. My problem, I mean, when I did my book, it was just kind of stuff I'd been writing to myself in like notebooks. And my thing is I've always just wanted to like point, and I wanted to say like, doesn't this thing kind of look like this other thing? And it is kind of like that thing in that book. And I sort of never paid much attention to whether, well, that's a movie and this is a piece of literature and this is a game. And actually, kind of getting these things to interact is something I'm trying to get better at because my problem is, and I do think um as maybe you suggest, I mean, the games writing that I read that comes out of Europe is very analytical or tends to be. It has maybe sort of one real insight that it's like really focused on and it takes a long time to get there. And I mean, there's a lot of great stuff being written. It's not to say that it's not any good, but it's very focused. And there does seem to be this American style that I'm really guilty of, which is I mentioned too many things. I have every time I'm doing an article with a journal, um, these editors, reviewers are really helpful because they'll say that, you mention Emerson, Wittgenstein, and Merleau-Ponty in a single paragraph, and Batman, and you need to like cut these down because it's way too much, and it's true. When I put an article together, I mean, I just take notes for a long time as far as like my process goes, if I could say something about that. I just kind of collect examples for a long time, and I'll try to keep different Google Docs to kind of disaggregate it all, and then eventually it reaches like this critical mass, and I think I find a way to maybe start the article. I think, oh, I guess I'm working on an article now, and then just trying to find my way, trying to thread up the examples in a way that makes a certain amount of sense or something, and excluding what doesn't really belong as a kind of act of close reading. The parallels are just they seem just very obvious, to me, so that I think I'd like to have a more careful way of putting these things together. But for me, it's just been noticing something like, George Berkeley's theory of idealism just seems to be exactly how video games work, like at least in like a 3D space. And I just thought this was like the coolest thing. And sort of trying to build that up more and more and find other examples that would kind of support it. And um, I don't know, learning to be a better scholar, and be more carefully like citational stuff, I think it helps give that kind of thing more of a backbone. Whereas when I did my book, there was it was like no sources at all. It was just me, it could just sound like you're just kind of talking to yourself about this stuff. Isn't this thing like this other thing and so forth. So um that's a long way to say that I've been trying to figure it out. And I'm trying to be more careful and I don't know, a better academic or a better thinker or something. But I've always loved to throw together these different disciplines and kind of point out resemblances. And I find that kind of thing convincing, but it does seem to be quite, I think maybe like an American style of thinking about games as, a kind of text, something to read closely and so forth.
I'm fascinated too by the way you use examples in your work, which I think is really interesting and compelling, and specifically actually like game examples. So as Brian mentioned, you'll sort of jump between like Wittgenstein and
Mhm.
Merleau-Ponty, and theorists and philosophers, who seem relevant, but then like Batman will also appear, but also Mario and also like Luigi's Mansion and also
Yeah,
Cyberpunk, like in the same paragraph.
right.
Um, so I have a thought about that. The first thing I just wanted before it drops out of my mind is just, you suggested that like being a better academic will help you be a better thinker or will cultivate a sort of an improved exercise in thinking. And I just want to say that's not necessarily true. Oftentimes being a better academic precisely means being a worse thinker. I say this as
Mm,
a proud academic, someone who loves
sure.
the work that we do and the profession
Hmm.
for despite all its flaws, but
Hmm.
um sometimes academic thinking is pretty erroneous and relies on a lot of received ideas about how arguments should be conducted, about what constitutes evidence and what constitutes
Hmm.
persuasiveness, which is usually just like
Hmm.
completely off base. So
Yeah.
that's a whole other can of worms. But
Uh-huh.
going back to the game examples, I don't know if I've ever read. I mean, Brian mentioned Frederick Jameson, the literary critic, before we came on as someone
Hmm.
else who will just like bounce between like,
Yeah. Hmm.
like Miles Davis and
Hmm.
Warhol and like Heidegger and then like, Charlotte Bronte or something like in one paragraph. And it's just like, what are you doing, man? Um,
Hmm.
but for you in particular, like I'm really fascinated by the way in which you just like will throw out so many disparate primary texts, like games, all at once and kind of view them synoptically, sort of clustered examples around a particular dynamic or idea. Uh,
Hmm.
and yet it's like you're also doing a kind of close reading, and you described your work as close reading, but that seems pretty, you know, antithetical to how close reading is often conducted in academic spaces. And by close reading, I just mean really sustained,
Yeah.
detail-oriented analysis of a single work or a
Right.
single example. So
Yeah.
I wondered if you could say more about like how does that come about? How does one even produce a paragraph that ranges so quickly, almost like hyperactively in a way that I think is really cool, but almost
Mhm.
like hyperactively across different game examples. Is there a method behind that, or is it more like is it a function of your process? This process of compiling examples that you mentioned earlier.
Mhm, mhm.
That's something I'm.
Yeah, no, I totally take your point. I think the closeness for me is it's always the way I play games too. It's trying to get like a knife between whatever kind of fissure you can find, a game. It's just kind of um opening up. But it's yeah, as soon as I get something that's, interesting or kind of artifactual or strange or doesn't work or um I'm happy to just sort of make use of it. Say, okay, this thing, and then, looking too closely on purpose. I've just for some reason it just popped in my mind when you were speaking about thinking about playing Roller Coaster Tycoon as a kid, and you could have this like the no exit sign where like you couldn't traffic could only go like one way, like they can go past the sign, but then they can't go the other direction, and funneling people into a hole, and this hole becomes just this mass of like bodies, and there's something like very strange and broken about that, and I mentioned it. I think one of the first things I wrote was like about virtual, like trash in virtual spaces or trash in games, like what that would be aesthetically. So just to say that. Um, Something like that, I sort of don't need to spend any more time with Roller Coaster Tycoon than that one example, and I'm happy to just kind of move on to something because I think that's strange. We can look at it closely. I don't feel this need that I think I've seen in a lot of places where it's like give this huge context to just, the moon in Cyberpunk 2770. Why isn't it moving? Why is it always just in the same place? And we can spend forever setting up that one observation. And it feels like that's interesting, but I kind of want someone to just like point that out and then go on to something else and tell me why, you know, what else is interesting. I mean, what else is there? And I think my fear that this desire of like wanting to be a better academic or something, I think with my book, with that kind of writing, I think I look like a generalist, and there's this sort of this, you know, um, there's something I like about a kind of amateur approach to thinking about these things, and I totally take your point too about as far as like what is interesting. I mean games in general are, uninteresting to a certain number of people. It's just like, you know um I so in that regard, like I've always thought, no, this is I'm happy to stand by something in World of Warcraft or some small, nothing of a kind of observation, say this is as interesting to me as something that's officially interesting, and that's written about by really smart people with degrees or something. I mean, I have no problem standing by that. But I think I have a kind of a self-consciousness, I guess, about not what's interesting, but I guess how I'm putting these things together. Because I do feel that, I mean, l- working looking at these articles has been a process of learning to be careful or kind of, so I wrote something most recently that to me feels like a much more structured kind of argument. I feel like I was able to put it together in kind of a logical order. I think earlier stuff that I wrote, there wasn't sort of a necessary way that I went about talking about. I just sort of needed to get it all out. I needed to talk about all of these things, and the order wasn't all that important. And again, that felt like a kind of just connect the dots, and you can connect dots in lots of ways. With games, it feels maybe, sort of um, you have this mass of, examples, and you want to talk about it all and bring it all together. And more recently, I've just felt good, I guess, that maybe I'm moving in a direction of, well, I could find one way to start with something, and then what's really like the best thing I should mention next, and we can go a little more methodically through these arguments. And
Yeah, and
yeah.
I mean, I want to again like make clear I'm really sympathetic to this style of like let me just get to
Mhm,
the interesting thing and then move on.
mhm. Sure,
And
sure.
because I that's something that I try to do in my own work too,
Yeah.
in my own way. And
Hmm.
I would say by and large, like academic criticism has a problem with context, with like this kind of dutiful laying out of context
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the kind of literature, the lit review, and then sort of all this structuring that goes into just like a single insight. And oftentimes it's like the power of the
Yeah.
insight is it's usually a kind of formal close reading sort of point about something interesting or strange happening in the
Hmm.
work. And it's like the payoff is just not there because we've had to
Yeah.
slog through so much setup. You know, it's like it's
Hmm.
a great point, but the setup kind of neuters it, and
Sure.
it does it no favors to have to like wade through all this
Hmm.
crap, you know,
Hmm.
like to get there.
Yeah.
And so I I I understand it's a different genre of writing, and sometimes you have to do that, but I just like I want to believe that there are ways of doing it much more efficiently than what's the norm today in
Hmm.
academic writing. Um,
Yeah.
Particularly because there's often, in my mind, a sense of like false consciousness where the author almost makes it seem like the context is the point, whereas like it's almost clear, like
Yeah.
on like a naive level of reading that like they were just interested in this one thing that they noticed.
Right. Right.
And it's
Of
like then they
course.
kind of like do all this work to justify noticing. And you shouldn't have to
Hmm.
justify noticing. I think that
Hmm.
you should be able to just notice and let that
Hmm.
be a starting point rather than an end point. You know, I
Yeah.
think making an endpoint also very often distorts the conclusions that you draw. Because if you've like set up all this stuff in the beginning, like here's why, you know, games are important, whatever. Here's why like the app, you know, like
Hmm.
avatars are interesting or important or something. And then you have this one example. It often then it's like the only way to make that like the conclusion commensurate with the setup is to say something really huge about the example. But oftentimes the example isn't that important. It's just interest. It's just like it's just an example. It's just something cool, interesting, you know, fun that we saw that we can ponder, you know, and
Hmm.
so I think like having to make the example then justify the setup often leads to disappointing results as well.
Yeah, and I would even suggest that, you can have a whole essay, which is just, isn't this interesting?
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine. It doesn't, I mean, I think I tried that with when I was writing about trash, and I tried to, I think I kind of forced some sort of conclusion on it, which is like, what's the takeaway from this? Or like, where's this headed? Or where are we going? Or, because as the hardware gets more powerful, sort of, you can have garbage and you can have just stuff lying around. You don't need to sweep it away constantly. And I think that's true. I don't know what if there's like some huge message or something, or I have to say something about ecology or,
Yeah.
get into something else. My problem often with a lot of, game studies properly of you talking about networking and ethics and gender and all these kinds of other things that are, worth discussing, of course, is that you often get the feeling that like, well, you have to pretend that you understand what video games are in the first place to even talk about this. I don't have Games are just so strange to me that to start with like, well, we all know how video games work and what they are, and I think they're so broken and they're so ambitious and so strange and funny, um, that to just kind of ignore all of that is to miss like quite a lot, I think. It's true. It's true for, painting. It's true for anything else. I mean, there's just ways that you look at a medieval painting, and if you think that that's like all that that person wished to do, I mean, if you gave them purple, they would have thrown it on everything. Like there's always these kind of strange limitations and a kind of brokenness and so much to talk about. If you take it for granted, I think there's a lot of and it's true now. Like there's so much still to talk about with games because I think we're just like overlooking quite a lot. It seems.
Yeah, I just want to
Not
jump
sure.
in. I just want to
Yeah.
jump in and echo what Nathan was saying, which is that I agree. I mean, a lot of like the more academic style can oftentimes not only be less interesting, but actually like undo the interestingness of the point that's being made in the first place, right? Like I've read so many excellent articles and I've read so many articles where I like the core point, but the core point is kind of belabored
Hmm.
for 25 pages when it could have been
Yeah.
and should have been maybe a 10-page article, a more minor article or whatever that didn't have to
Hmm.
take up as much of my time,
Yeah.
which is like, it does like, I guess, bring up a lot of questions of why we do this, why we do it methodologically, why we're doing it in the first place, I guess, which is a whole other
Hmm.
question.
Hmm.
But I mean, like one thing that I identify with this too. Like I feel, uh, that you can go hear somebody give a conference paper, you can read a really excellent article, and even I was just talking with a friend about this, even if you aren't a scholar of the same thing. The example that I always think of is like Derrida, right? Like people there are some real big Derrida heads out there who can quote from everything he's ever written, and they'll write an article where they're quoting from 50 different texts by Derrida, And at the end of it, if you hear them give a paper like this, you might say, wow, that was really impressive, but I have no sense of anything vital in this.
Hmm.
It's
Sure.
not interesting. Maybe there's some textual stuff that's cool. Maybe there's even some kind of archival work about different drafts of something. This is I work on Proust quite a bit, so there's a whole, industry of certain types of scholarship on Proust that go really deep into, different drafts of his novel and, certain words being changed or something. But if there's not an argument or an insight attached to that, then that should be, in my opinion, kind of like an addendum to a critical edition that, you look in the back and you can see that, right?
Mm.
That doesn't need to be a 50-page paper or a 30-page paper or something like that. And so it for me, it's refreshing to see like examples of texts, games here
Mhm.
being the texts, and in the case of the other article, the secret sharer being one of the texts as well. I'd rather see more examples of texts being used than different philosophers being used almost as examples to contextualize those texts, if that makes sense. So, like, if you can make
Mhm.
a point in your own words, I guess my point is, if you can make a point in your own words, why, to a certain extent, why quote 25 different,
Sure.
things to
Yeah.
make that
And
point?
let me just add that I think that this is something that academic games criticism in particular has a problem with. There's a sense in which I almost feel like academic games criticism oversights, like for very fundamental points that the author almost like clearly just came up with on their own, and it's like it almost feels like I mean, to me, being made this is sort of ungenerous, so but it often feels a bit like I kind of it's like legitimacy theater or something. It's like here, let me just make very clearly like how, make very evident how much research I've done and like
Sure.
how embedded this is in with like in a scholarly dialogue.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's like, the point, it's like oftentimes what we're dealing with in especially now and in the early what would be historically relatively speaking like the earlier point in the sort of aesthetics of games is like pretty fundamental questions about like what avatars are, what space and time
Hmm.
are, how gameplay works, and it's like a lot of those things are just intuitive to a child,
Hmm.
like and sometimes you see game writers like making points that are like intuitive to a child but then like marshaling like three authorities to support them, and it's just like I think I admire the gesture. I admire the collegiality. I admire the sense of like professionalism
Yeah.
and sort of paying service to other people who have written about things, which is very important, a very important part of our work.
Yeah.
But I also feel sometimes it strikes me as like there has to be a way to do this where it doesn't seem like you're just citing authorities on a very basic point that like anyone could have sort of come up with, like because you don't like the idea that anyone just to sort of fabricate an example, I don't know that like games have a weird sense of space. It's like yeah, they do. Like you don't like we don't need to sort of cite authorities on that basic point,
Yeah.
It's like a fun it would be like saying like novels, you know, I don't know, like what's the example? Like novelistic characters don't always behave like humans, and then you cite like five people. It's like no, they don't do it because they're fictional beings. They're fake, Um,
Yeah.
sorry, this has become a bit of a rant. I meant this to be a short,
No, no, totally.
but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but yeah, I do think there's something interesting happening with like practices
Um,
of citation. It feels a bit closer to maybe
mhm.
what you see in the sciences, or the social
Mhm.
sciences, which I again
Yeah.
I think it's interesting and I admire that, but that's just not the kind of
Hmm.
I don't know. I just don't. It doesn't click with me. It's not. I think there are ways of doing justice to other sort of engaging in critical dialogue that don't require that sort of like authority grounding for every single point.
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite thing I ever found, just like citationally, in writing about games was this woman. It was in some Duke journal from, God, it could have been like the 70s or 80s. Maybe not that late. It was a little while ago. She was talking about Homer. This is the article on like space and time and how it's represented in Berkeley stuff. And she says that when Homer is describing something, a place or some people, it's as though they all kind of lie dormant until he talks about them and then they're like activated. And I thought, God, that's just like a character or the inside of a house in a video game or something, sort of not there at all. And then you activate it, it's all dormant as artifacts and waiting. And she got so close to saying exactly what I was saying, but like just stopped just short of it. And it was that kind of thing is for me really thrilling to be able to kind of um, make these connections. Not like I need to, you know, not even the sense of like doing due diligence or something, but um, connecting these things that seem like no, they're talking about something totally different. The sometimes you end up being really broad when you kind of make these comparisons. You would say like, well, if you squint, and you look at these two things, don't they kind of look alike? But still, it's bringing something like that together for me is really fun, and you don't necessarily know where you're going to find it. And like the Barclay point and the idealist point was like something that occurred to me like years ago, and I just kind of held on to it for a long time, and then ended up being like the basis of think just a way of thinking about games and putting a lot of pressure on that as opposed to like once I used like a term from Heidegger and this reviewer said like you don't need to do this like gesturing at Heidegger thing. It's like, oh, good, fair point, and cut it out.
That's a great point. Like that moment really stood out to me actually in your article where you cite this thing about Homer. And I think that's exactly what it is, right? We should, I mean, this is at least how I feel. Like we should be most interested in when we find something that's just like a few degrees off from what we want to
Mhm.
say, right? This is
Yeah.
so much more compelling than finding a philosopher who's saying exactly what we want to say about games, except
Right.
they've said it
Right.
about literature or something, right? That
Yeah.
degree of difference is like where the kind of creative, I mean, because criticism or scholarship has to be at least somewhat creative, right? That's where the creative
Mhm.
spark comes, and that's, I mean, you can tell, I mean, just I'll say like your writing felt really inspired, I think, like, in a way that that analytic sort of criticism does not to me at least, so when you find that, you'll also be a better writer, like this is what makes
Mhm.
for a good article is when you find, or I always think I always think about Nathan, your comparison of Hunter of the Dark and Bloodborne. Like that's just a great, like of course we all know Bloodborne is Lovecraftian, but you found specifically this moment that lines up in this way that's kind of eerie or uncanny or whatever, and that gives the fuel for the whole piece, the whole comparison, right? Rather than, somebody who has an analytic theory of, what it means to look into the distance or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I take off something on the Homer example, which I also is like one of the standout moments in that essay, which I really like. I mean, you know that I'm obsessed with the sort of the game logic of Homer in other contexts too.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that I really enjoy about your work, and again, something that I'm also quite interested in my own work, is the sort of the analytic or close reading exercise of taking the weird paradoxes of games entirely literally in an existential sense.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So the idea is like, let's take something that we know is a function of game design,
Right. Right.
and treat it like it was actually a lived experience. What would that do? What sort of experience would that be? What are the philosophical implications of that? Which is, you say like for instance in the idealism essay, like, certain famous propositions of idealism are made, I think you say all too real, and you could
Mhm.
also understand that it's like all too literal in game worlds, just
Mhm.
precisely
Mhm.
in that like things only exist when you look at them, or things
Mhm.
only exist when you are near them, and then they kind of blink out of existence when you turn your back to them or when you get a certain
Mhm.
distance away from them. Um, and it's an exercise that you could just do ad nauseum, in games,
Mhm.
because games are just so dissonant with lived experience. Like
Mhm.
on every level, there's just weird shit in games that just doesn't really make mimetic sense
Yeah.
because, of course, like games are both representing and affording play. I had a couple thoughts about that. I mean, one is,
Mhm.
I would say that in my work, I often do that in novels too. And I sort of even, and I have a piece, an essay where I sort of, it's in the modernism book that's, on the way. But I sort of coined this term phenomenalization, which for me is the idea of taking a kind of weird rupture or paradox or contradiction in the grain of prose, of writing, as as diegetically or narratively or representationally real. So if a sentence repeats sort of reiterates or repeats that a character walks through a room, walks into a room, we could very well read that, partly because it's how we might see it in our mind's eye, as that character actually walked into the room twice, which is impossible because you can't walk into a room when you're already in the room, you know?
Mhm.
But literature is full of stuff like this, partly because
Mhm.
just like in games, like words are not a fail-safe way of representing lived experience. Like words have certain properties, like they have to be, at least in English, or they have to be linear.
Mhm.
They're not good at simultaneity, right? There's a
Mhm.
sense in which it's something that is unfolding in a kind of, yeah, a synchronous way, right, is going to be turned into a sequence, even when we don't intend it to be turned into a sequence. There are all these different mismatches between the way that the mechanics of language or words represent the world
Yeah.
and how, you know, and what are actually like what the text actually wants to represent or depict. And,
Mhm.
you know, I guess one thought is that I do feel that in novels that feels like more it feels more like reading against the grain of the text because the text is,
Mhm.
novels are so committed, or very often realist novels at least are so committed to this illusion of like, well, this is just life, this is just a transcription or a representation of life.
Mhm. Mhm.
Whereas games, what's fascinating about them is precisely or often that like yes, they want to represent life, but they want to be a game and they wear that on their sleeves. So I wonder, I mean, this is going to read as a challenge, it's really, if it is, it's a challenge to myself too, because like my Bloodborne
Mhm.
book is like 50% of this, of just like, let's take
Mhm.
weird things in Bloodborne completely literally.
Yeah.
Is there kind of diminishing returns or kind of like deadened or lessened sort of value or power in that gesture of literalizing these paradoxes when the paradoxes are like very front and center? You can imagine like take this to an
Mhm.
extreme, like take a game of chess. Like what if you described a game of chess as a literal description of a battle, and like you say like, well, what if a knight, what if the king's knights like could only move, like one, to the side 50% of the distance that they crossed when they charged forward. It's like, and you can imagine
Mhm.
this battlefield of like bishop, bishop, which a bishop, it's so weird, like a bishop hat, a guy like a church vest
Mhm.
like jetting diagonally across the battlefield to like kick over a soldier,
Mhm.
and a
Mhm.
queen shooting all around like a billiard ball or something. I said billiard ball like I'm like in a Balzac novel or something. Like I guess like but yeah, like there's that's a case where
Sure.
it would be an interesting sort of fictional experiment. I could actually it would be kind of a fun like little writerly exercise, but I do wonder
Yeah.
if like it would feel like a bit, and I
Yeah.
wonder
Yeah.
if that's ever a risk that you're sort of contending with or thinking about as you sort of
Mhm.
unfold these paradoxes.
For sure. I think often this is why I'm trying to, right, if you really just had this kind of nonstop, like, well, isn't this weird? Well, this isn't this weird as well, and this is even weirder. And that could be, sort of so what. I think I do try to kind of constellate these things in a way that they inform each other. And also take an example of like how, as the gamepad, right, your controller has gotten more and more complicated. It's just more buttons, more triggers, more everything. Avatars in games have, there's a really strong correlation with how complex they've become. You just sort of run out of things that like a four-limbed avatar can do. So now he has like a bird in a backpack that he walks around with. Now there's like they have this like Siamese relationship that develops, or you control a whole army, or you control a group of Pikmin, or every avatar now has like a little floating droid companion, right? The way the like phenomenally or in some other sense has been my will when I put it into a game, it just sort of ran out of places to go as my will became more complicated. I mean, there's so much more that I can put into, like intentionally I put into a game and it had to go somewhere. And it's funny to see that avatars kind of respond by like exploding in complexity and number and shifting all those kind of things. I mean, something like that, I think, is one thing to point out. Like, isn't it weird to have like two characters like Banjo and Kazooie who like are of one mind essentially and are kind of like minded together or ensouled or something. And there's it's weird. You're pointing out something weird, but you can also try, I think, to explain changes that you're seeing in games and like where they're coming from rather than one developer does one thing, one does another one. And I had some other example I was trying to think of, but oh, I don't know. I mean, the doppelganger article, I mean, talking about Celeste, when Madeline is like sitting on the mountain talking to Theo, there's this really strange moment where you get to choose the questions that Theo asks her, even though I'm Madeline, I'm not Theo. And then there would seem this sort of fits the strangeness, right, which never happens again, which is kind of the strangest thing of all in the game. It fits perfectly. I mean, I think probably accidentally really fits this like mental health theme that the game has of she's learning to ask herself questions, and I think what I was going to say was often there's a metaphorical reading that you can bring to these things where they're not just strange, but they sort of accidentally or intentionally inform something about the game, something more broadly, I mean, very intentionally, and inside you can unplug your own avatar can unplug himself from you, the player. That's a, very intentional and, way of suggesting something, right, about control. And then in other games, these things are there to be seen, I think, and you can kind of draw some kind of conclusion from them, whether they're an accident, whether it's just a result of the game being kind of broken, what I love about one of my favorite things is if fog in like the early 3D games like Turok and South Park and these things. It was a solution that developers came up with because they wanted to bring games outside, but they also could, right? You just couldn't show things that were very far away, but they wanted to do anything. They didn't want to wait till they could like really do it. And so they're like, oh, we'll just fill everywhere with fog. Painters in Europe did exactly the same thing when they wanted to go outside. I mean, precisely the same thing for the same, for basically the same reasons. With painting, they just didn't know how to show things that were further away. And of course, developers know how to do it, but they can't. So there's a slightly different constraint at work. But and we're game developers in the 90s looking at European art to figure, they just intuited the same thing. And I think something like that is, again, there's something kind of broken there, or there's a limit that's imposed, and a kind of choice is made. And it's amazing how some of these same solutions just come up again and again, like almost necessarily. And so making that kind of historical gesture maybe is another way I think of getting beyond the sort of trivialism of like, wasn't this weird? Is something weird so far? Um,
So it seems like, I mean, it seems maybe to put a further, wedge or something into the conversation here that it's not just a question of taking things literally, but what we take literally. I mean, it would be, and there is scholarship that does this, right? I think and it tends to be kind of uninteresting. We could take literally the material fact of producing a painting or producing a game or whatever, right? And that's going to be that kind of really historical genealogical sort of scholarship that uh doesn't imagine or something. So maybe it's like
mm,
imaginatively taking things literally is kind of
mm,
what
mm,
maybe what we're seem to be aligned on in terms of approaching works of art, right? And maybe this is also the thing that helps us see beyond the medium specificity that can be so constraining to
mhm, mhm,
like this is what allows us to compare, for example, like a video game and a work of literature, and maybe
mhm,
maybe
mhm.
just as like a side note, because one thing that really struck me, and I wonder, I guess this is just a little small question, but I wonder if you've thought, so when I was reading the doppelganger article, the text that really came to mind to me is William Wilson by Poe. And I wonder if you've like thought about that text, if you've read it, or if
No,
you
I don't know it. Yeah.
okay, it's a text where it's like one of his it's a slightly longer short story. I think it's probably about 30 pages or so, where the titular character, William Wilson, has like a double also named William Wilson, but we also find out that his name, like none of their names are actually William Wilson. He just says like I'll tell you that my name is William Wilson. So we already have this kind of like weird pseudonym going on. But
Mhm,
there's this other, like when he's at school, this other boy just keeps showing up throughout his life, like this same kind of double of him. Uh,
mm,
I won't spoil the ending, but the ending does seem to have
mm,
maybe an element of combat that
mm,
leaves the reader very kind of uncertain about what exactly happens, and it might be kind of a good maybe a good example that I don't know, just it came to mind for me as an example that really
Fascinating.
works with the discussion you're having there with games.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the Prestige or something with the clones fighting and
Yeah,
one of those left or something. Yeah,
yeah.
that's
Eric,
fascinating.
could we
Mhm.
flash back a bit to I feel like we could have led with this, but would you mind saying a bit about what got you into games writing or how you started writing about games,
Sure.
especially as someone who did an MFA in poetry and is also has other interests, say, strictly in literature or on the poetry side.
Mhm.
This could also serve as a transition into talking a bit about the the early games writing that we I think
Yeah.
both on in game magazines and such.
Yeah, yeah. I couldn't have sort of stumbled into it more, really. I was finishing my MFA at the University of Florida in poetry, and I mean, there's just so many coincidences. So I was taking a seminar, like the last seminar I needed for my degree. It was called Critical Plant Studies, and it was with this guy named Terry Harpold. And it was, I mean, some of it was interesting. It was, Our Plants People. There was all these, we read a lot of like Ursula K. Le Guin and other things, and then some new, a little bit sort of woo-woo biologist who, talks to plants in the rainforest, all kinds of different stuff. Um, and not for the course at all, but I'd been having a conversation with a friend about the aesthetics of like virtual garbage or what that would mean. I don't know how this conversation got going, but we sort of kind of hashed it out. And then I think I started just taking some notes on this idea and trying to put something down. I I don't think I had any intention to like write like an article for a journal. Maybe I thought it could be an essay or something. And I had written a few thousand words of this, and then I thought, oh, I need to write a paper for this seminar. And I think, well, trash, that's kind of ecology, right? So I just, pitched it as like I told Terry that was like, oh, I'm writing this. This is, can I do this for the class? And I think by the time I talked to him, I was like already done with it. And well, it turns out he's on actually the board of game studies. He used to write about games, and he wrote this really an article that I still cite once in a while called "Screw the Grew" about it's called "Screw the Grew: Metalepsis, Recapture, something else." And he makes this one really great point, which is that games are often um, they have this. I mean, they could take it up or not, but like they have to do something, right? They have to get rid of the corpses of enemies, and you could just have them fade away, or you could try to recapture that requirement diegetically and say, "Oh, they turn into sand and blow away," like in Prince of Persia, something like that. So that the something that has to happen is kind of a technical restraint or constraint is recaptured, brought in, so forth. And I cited him, and that ended up being actually really useful for that paper. And anyway, I kind of worked on it from there. After that semester, sent it to postmodern culture. I have no idea why there as opposed to some other place. I mean, really just didn't really totally know what I was doing. But after that came out and, the peer reviewers were like really helpful. It was like book reviewing now. I just sort of tried it on a whim and thought, oh, I guess I know how to do this now. And you know, video games are I played them as a kid. Also grew up in Florida, so just every vacation was like go to a theme park. So this fascination for artificial spaces in particular is just so hardwired in my brain. And when I went to college, I went really just off games. We needed to read some books, and but I'd sort of follow the news, and video essays became kind of a thing, and I kept up with games. And what's been so satisfying in the last few years is in writing about games, it's really allowed me to exercise this interest that never went away. When I would look at games and they look sort of cozy, but they're strange. I'd had like lingering ideas. Some things about games in my book that I kind of mined later and returned to. They just never stop being, just fascinating to me. Even I wouldn't even necessarily have a thought, but now I can kind of work through that. And it's been something I and then I realized game studies was like games research was like a thing. I had no idea, and I mean, and I found your work in LARB and realized that there was this kind of, new wave of writing a kind of a middlebrow level in magazines for a literary audience, which we could also talk about too, is seems very American, seems new. That seems to me where games are really going to reach the most people. I think we're always trying to say that like games are more mainstream than ever, but like sure, everyone knows what video games are, everyone plays video games, but I think we're probably at the limit of people who are going to read academic journals and, those magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly are, you know, like going the way of the dodo and things are going out of print. And I think it's really it again, it seems to me, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of transitioning away now, but it seems very American too that, you look at Europe, there are whole programs, institutes, so much of space is given to games, right? And here it's never like that. It's existing humanities departments that like make space for games, and they'll put it into, and it was exactly what I think my point of view anyway. It seems like film was the same thing. You want to be a film philosopher? Well, we make a little space for you in an English department somewhere. And now with magazines too, same thing. It's not that we're gonna have this explosion of like magazines that are just dedicated to games writing because everyone's into games now. No, it's existing kind of literary, like middle highbrow readership that is now going to be willing to consider games as just something that's quite interesting, like film, like anything else. I have a friend who he's just like terminally well read in Marx and Lacan and a lot of like historical theory, and texted me and he said he was thinking about writing about like longue durée history and representations of nationalism in strategy games, and he's not someone who like wants to write about games necessarily. He's someone who had these other interests in games now seem like another object. There's another thing we're bringing into the kind of the mix of things. And so I think I personally I just sort of lucked out a little bit in um, getting into writing about games at this time. It's not that it's brand new or anything, and it's not didn't start yesterday, but um, it's exciting to be in like a smaller field. It's really been satisfying to kind of get out this fascination that I had and that I was kind of ignoring for a while when I was in college. And yeah, it's just changing in a lot of ways in terms of readership and a ton of other things.
Could we talk a little bit about EGM? Uh,
Hmm.
and I guess since the way in, I'll just say, it's striking how similar in some ways our experiences have been because I too, I had this sort of abiding fascination with like the weirdness of virtual spaces, and I was an avid gamer as a kid, and then went to college. I've talked about this on the podcast actually before, but like stopped playing games totally, but then, sort of have been, when I started writing about them, really sort of consistently in 2020, like just kind of working through a lot of the stuff from like when I was a kid, kind of like
Yeah,
working
yeah,
fascinations. Um,
right.
and yeah, this is something I think we've texted about this or talked about this a little bit, about, I was on a podcast with Michael Clune and talked about how I learned to close read from games. Like games, it was
Yeah.
really kind of like seeing the paradoxes and the kind of glitches and sort of spatio-temporal distortions of games, very subtle ones, sort of attune me to those same things happening in novels. And my training is in, literature. So I was first sort of practicing that mode of analysis and
Mhm.
phenomenalization, in novels. But I would also say that I learned to write from reading EGM, as a kid and as a teen, I had no interest whatsoever in academics and no interest
Mhm.
whatsoever in basically reading. But I
Mhm.
would just absorb, like the EGM was like a talismanic object that when it
Mhm.
arrived, I would sort of just savor every page. And one thing that's striking rereading some of, the issues now for this conversation is like it's a magazine that's made to be savored, like there's so much going on every
Mhm.
page. These
Mhm.
like subsections,
Yeah.
little text boxes, little jokes, um,
Mhm.
different segments or themes, right, or recurring bits, like images, incredibly playful and incredibly sort of eye-catching and exquisitely, I think, sort of conceived and designed, where you could just
Mhm.
like linger over every page. It's so dense with visual and
Mhm.
textual sort of content. Um, but on a basic level of just like learning how sentences are strung together, learning what like rhythm is. I would say I probably still in some weird way like am echoing the rhythms of those
Mm.
EGM writers like to this day. And it's funny like rereading looking at the PDFs I was like, "Oh my God, like yeah, like Dan Shu, like I remember that name or like Crispin Boyle. Like these are names that are just seared into my memory, and their sentences I think in some unconscious way are also
Mm.
just deeply embedded in my
Mm.
yeah, in my sort of instincts as a writer, where I,
Mm.
often when I'm crafting sentences, I'm just following what sounds, I'm just like, does that sound good or does it not? And that's
Mm.
it's an almost unconscious process, and that has to be learned somewhere, right? It doesn't come out of, it doesn't certainly doesn't come from speaking, so and it doesn't come from reading novels because novel, it's like if you wrote like a Victorian novel, you would be really lame, like your writing would suck. But so yeah, it's like that it really was a formative resource for me, like maybe the most formative literary
Mm.
influence in my
Mm.
life.
Mm. Yeah, I collected like game books, walkthroughs, all of the kind of like ancillary materials, and then sort of a person like really casual. I mean, I when um that was on this podcast, right? When we were talking to Michael Flynn, I really resonated with that a lot with this learning to like the earliest memories I have of like giving my careful attention to anything. It's like trying to, drive backwards on a Mario Kart course or something, and get somewhere you're not supposed to be. Um, and I would pick up those materials as a kid. I wasn't like a really consistent reader of game magazines growing up. I'd sort of grab them and flip through. It was fascinating to look at them now, the other day. I mean, it made me think of like, I don't know if you'd hate this comparison, but it just felt like it was like Maxim magazine or something, or like, I mean, really like like gas stations. It was just like the jokes. I was shocked by one how dense every page is, just like crammed in. I for some reason in my mind I imagined something a little more just like here's an article and there's maybe a column or something else. It's just like every inch of the whole thing is I mean, and then like page after page after page of advertisements and these kind of like sort of print preview things, and it's fascinating, yeah. And I can imagine. I mean, it was like I don't know, like John Cheever was in Playboy and like Raymond Carver. Like there's the mix of like high and low is something that I think we've really maybe separated those things in American magazine culture now. Um, but back in the day, it's you could have like really terrific writing in right into a place that was making like a weird joke about like Tomb Raider's breast or something like that. Like and then you can go on to like a pop quiz and something else. And I don't know, it's I mean maybe in something like Cleveland Review of Books and the LARB, the way we're sort of bringing things back into, but I think that's more of the case of just games being taken more seriously now. And it's like, well, now we'll give you some space in the space where other stuff is serious stuff is talked about too.
I'll just say one last quick thing on that, and then I'll shut up. Justin, you also shared the heterotropias, some
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah. I was thinking that.
which I honestly I've heard of it, but I hadn't, I'm a bad game writer in that I just don't get out much and am not super plugged into the world of games criticism. So it was really interesting to read these, and it's just a beautiful magazine. It's so cool.
Mhm.
And yet
Mhm.
I want to go out on a limb, and I'm going to speak purely for myself. This is my own fallible opinion.
Oh.
That despite the kind of cultured context of heterotopias and the sort of intelligence and thoughtfulness that's being brought to the objects. And despite the crude kind of like teen, whatever, like 90s, early aughts, like boy humor and incredibly sort of just like male perspective of
Right.
Sonic Game Monthly, I think the latter has better writing than
Mm.
Heterotopia. Like I think the
Mm.
sentence just on a level of like engagement and pulse and
Mm.
sort of tactile qualities and fun and the kind of playfulness.
Mm. Mhm.
I just think these like short little nuggets of sometimes they're just a couple sentences, like you'll have a box and it's just like a couple sentences. That's the entire little piece or essay or article or what have you.
Mhm.
Um, they're just punchier, they're better, they take more risks, they're funnier, and you know, my sympathies go with that style of writing, I think a little bit.
Sure. I don't disagree. I mean, I totally get why they would need to be immediately attention grabbing and punchy and really sort of whip smart writing for that kind of that age of readership, maybe, or just that kind of readership. There's a lot of other things that are distracting. I mean, all of that makes perfect sense. The writing in Heterotopia is, I mean, I'm kind of like floored when I every time I look at them by like the presentation and how everything's put together. And but yeah, I mean, I take your point. I was reading something in there about Kentucky Route Zero, and it's very intelligent writing, but it's sort of um, kind of mournfully, dourly intelligent, and it's like I've done this. I've done something really important by writing about this video game. It's just like it's beautiful writing, but I agree. I mean, and I mean, it makes me think of like some of these essayists I follow like on YouTube, right? Who have like really stupid handle names and um it was like the cursed judge or something that's very teenage about a lot of it. And some of it is presented as, I mean, I actually don't really like Jacob, what's his name? I mean, the kind of the best known one of these guys who, the YouTubers who try to make they really try to elevate it and bring like a kind of seriousness to it, and that you think you're doing like a master class or something. And I like the guys who are just kind of thinking out loud, and they're not being very careful. And the video is called like games about balls or something, and then it ends up being like actually really interesting. Somebody like there's a guy Annie Austin who does videos where he has like hair clips on and he has this like terrible microphone. And he was talking about Twilight Princess, and he was saying, and it was clearly just the presentation was just totally off the cuff. He was saying like the Hyrule in Twilight Princess is so big and so empty, but they give you the horse to ride on. And he's like, what if they just didn't give you the horse, but they made a smaller world? Would that be the same thing? You just cover the same amount of content, but and I just thought this is a wonderful observation, and or he talks about how certain levels in Banjo-Kazooie are sort of like you're outdoors because you're in a swamp, but like it's clearly like you're inside of this like cylinder that's like totally enclosed, and then he'll go on to some other point, and say something, just like the most juvenile. I mean, that is like purely. There's not any sense of like I need to say this a certain way for a certain vibe or something like that. It's just like I'm getting straight to some point, and it's really attention grabbing, and it really actually works, and ends up being quite interesting. Even though you'd think like maybe, take out the hair clips and get like a studio or something, but no.
Maybe part of the EGM thing, because I also you know, read this a bunch when I was younger. And I think Nathan, as you said, this is bringing back some memories for sure, like looking over some of these issues. I mean, part of other than the writing, obviously, there's the layout, which is we said is attention grabbing or eye grabbing, but it's also very game-like. I mean, I like specifically just like the layout is so chaotic, and yet there are also like the kind of repetitive segments that I remember when I was a kid, like the I would like check on certain things when I got the new issue, right? I would like, oh, what's the, whatever. I don't know. I forget what the segments are called, but like there was one or two segments that each time there was a new issue, I would go look at that first. That was like the thing that like, that I would
Mm.
check on that I knew was going to be there or something, right? So there is like something about maybe I don't know. This is just kind of an errant thought, I guess, but just something about this sort of writing or print as a format that yeah, that we just don't really, I don't know. I think, yeah, it's not really something we have anymore. Even with a beautiful journal that, something like Heterotropias that
Yeah.
I agree, like it looks amazing, but I don't feel like I'm playing a game when I'm reading it,
Hmm.
in a way that I
I'm just,
do when I'm like looking at EGM.
I'm just thinking about Chris Ware for some reason. He's the graphic novelist who you have a story and you read it, but he packs it in with like fold outs, and the cover can be taken off and like rearranged to make like a different cover for the book, or there's like a quiz inside, and he just crams in on every page in the middle of the story too sometimes. And he does this like Acme novelty library. And it feels like it's more nostalgic than anything, and I think really just trying to like evoke some older sort of like Cracker Jack, presentation of you get a bunch of freebies and this thing. Um, Intentionally kind of anachronistic now to do it rather than just like any book, but um, would be nice to see that kind of thing not just as anachronistic, nostalgic, like doesn't just remind you of the way we used to do these things, but actually, getting I mean maybe it's anything like was it UFO 50? That Steam game that came out was like 50 mini games packed in and you buy once and some games you play them for 5 minutes and they're not very good and you try another one and moving away from like the game is such a huge big like I don't know, presentation or object or something. And it's like, some of these aren't any good. We threw a bunch in there, see what you like, and grab something else. Didn't cost you anything.
Or like the gold saucer in Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah,
Or
with the
like they included an entire area which is like, look at all these crappy games that you can play. But they're like it's like a 3D snowboarding game, you know? It's like
right, 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 right.
and the
Yeah,
amazing thing
exactly.
about the about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is that I mean it takes the exact same sensibility, but
Mm,
at a completely unsustainable and even suicidal degree, renders it at like modern levels of fidelity. So they're like, it's an entire space video game that like most people will never play or even know exists. And you can like, you're like flying a 3D spaceship and there's a whole point scoring system. And like there's like a chocobo racing game where there's like actual like upgrade trees or like, there's actual sort of
that's
stat
great.
considerations or like builds,
Mm,
where every course is totally unique. It's like there's like a whole bunch of courses that are just 3D rendered, like unique
mm,
courses, obstacles and stuff. That sort of thing was way cheaper back in the PS1 days.
hmm
You could kind of throw shit together, but um, that sort of grab bag approach and kind of like loud, like I mean, it's an actual the Golden Saucer is an
hmm
actual arc, in the world of Final Fantasy VII.
hmm hmm
Go
hmm
circle to one of your interests, but
hmm
that kind of just restless and sort of like almost yeah like guerrilla approach to sort of populating this virtual world or this virtual object is really cool and feels like it's more and more it's less and less common if not extinct in at least in AAA games now.
Yeah, I love these games that have, I mean, like Celeste is one that has like a game inside of it, but I'm thinking about Crow Country, which, um, I mean, it has an arcade in it that you can power on, and then there's a bunch of little arcade games. But there's a charm about it, which is the opposite of that, which is they're not full-fledged games at all. Like one of them is like dolphin jumper, and you press a button and the dolphin jumps, and there's like nothing to do at all. Like, and it looks terrible, and it has I mean, the game itself has like this kind of PS1 graphics. And so they're very careful to like not have this weird clash. Like the game is just as realistic as the environment that it's in, but it's like getting a Happy Meal toy, and you can do like kind of one thing with it and it barely moves at all and go on to the other one. And for me, I don't know what it is. I just found that like extremely charming. This game that is like it's not unambitious, but it's very retro, very limited, very like fixed points of view. And then you have like inside of it this like barely holding together this, there's like kind of a skee ball thing or there's this other thing. Um, I don't know, maybe it feels unnecessary when, including some of these things and you just do it anyway. I mean, I would have been fine if I went into the arcade in Crow Country and none of the games worked, and it was just kind of a space to move through. And the fact that they gave me that anyway, I just felt, something about that excess or that unnecessary inclusion is really really charming and fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think, just going back to EGM for a second, like
Right.
how much they must have been paying for ink, you know? Like
Mhm.
every
Yeah.
single page is full
Yeah.
color. There are these, I mean,
hmm
this is just what magazines were, I guess, back in the day, but still, this is incredibly complex, like layout, design, um,
hmm
almost full black. I mean, I have it open on one side of my screen now, and there's like there would be like four full page ads for like one game, and it's like
Right. Right.
like almost the entire page is black with some other stuff on it or whatever, and it's yeah, it's totally gratuitous, but there's something, I mean, this is why it's something that's worth, this is partly why it's something worth going back to look at, right? I mean, this
hmm
is a risky thing to do, at least when you're starting out or before it becomes kind of classic, this is something that's so much investment on the part of the creator. Yeah.
Funny that we don't, I don't know, care for, I mean, there's been such a reaction now to AAA games, which give you so much more than you could ever do anything with. And seems like we don't want it so much anymore. It's just,
But the problem is that AAA games give you so much of the same shit. Like, I
mm,
think Final Fantasy Rebirth is a total outlier in that respect, in
mm,
that it's giving you like AAA games have done this sort of it's not I think part of the sort of the turning kind of the turning against them, that we see like I think among both like sort of gamer sort of intelligentsia and then like just regular
mm,
gamers that like they're full of just copy paste garbage, which is so they're at once luxurious and like incredibly thrifty in
mm,
a way that
mm,
feels like you're being almost like conned. It's like, yes,
right.
Assassin's Creed has like, like an entire, all of the entire ancient Greek world, but like every island looks the same and has the same trees and has the same buildings. Um, and so what's shocking is that like when you go to a literally the lowest tier of location in Final Fantasy Rebirth. Like just not even not a side quest, not a side activity that's like to check off your like completion or whatever, but literally just an area that has treasure.
Mm,
Some of them have unique assets. Like there's like a pirate cove that has unique pirate like treasure there. That's just like this is
mm,
crazy. You don't see this in games anymore of like actual singularity, that's curated and something that we talked it's actually something we talk about a lot on this podcast, but um, that there's an interesting way in which like luxury can appear,
mm,
and that's like it's doubled, and it often is it's doubled. It's like the luxury of Final Fantasy Rebirth is precisely this sort of representation of riches because it's like you see those riches nowhere else in the game. It's like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
hidden treasure and crap. Um, but like that doesn't have to be at a totally like sort of cutting edge level of graphical fidelity. Like a game like Crow Country, where
Mm,
it just they like as you said, like the designers made the choice to have unique little games in each of these boxes, or at least some of these game cabinets. Like it feels like it's not so much that it's more content, it's that it's like curated and unique content. And AAA games, like they've become more and more allergic to offering anything that could be missed or could be seen as secondary or optional to the for the player because it would be a wasted expense. It's part of again like what makes FromSoft games often so cool too, is that they'll have these like entire universes hidden behind like a trap door that only like 5% of the players would ever find if they weren't using a guide. And it's like three new biomes, it's like a whole sky area and a whole forest area that you would just never see and it contains, is by and large not a repetition of things you find elsewhere.
Yeah,
Um,
I took your point about when you're talking about horror games on a previous episode about there's like a generosity that if maybe it was the term you used. You go into a room and it's there's like it's kind of static and you have this environment that's been meticulously like put together and there just seems to be so generous and in turn you feel really endeared to it or something that they've like afforded you this just even just to look at as like it's not copy pasted from another room. Or I was thinking of in The Last of Us Part One, I just remember being so impressed when you get the horses near the end of the game because I would just think like, what other developer? I mean, most if they had this horse asset, you would have got a horse 5 minutes into the game. It was like bring the horse in all the time because it'd just be like another thing that you could be making use of,
yeah.
and it would seem to like I don't know increase the players. A sense of like the value of the game or something like that I've been given more, but like to hold off on that complicated aspect all the way to the end I thought was like there's something really patient and careful and mature about that. Even
Yeah.
withholding in that sense, and maybe in a horror game, just giving you so much.
Yeah, it's like they don't either don't realize or are sort of conditioned to sort of co counteract their instinct, which is
Mm,
or their realization, their perception of the fact that actually what makes something luxurious is the fact that it's used once and generous, like
mm,
and
mm,
not, even having the horse appear twice is already an incredibly sort of significant artistic decision just on the level of pure presentation.
Hmm.
And that's how most games operate. Like you'd at least have it twice. You'd have the intro
Hmm.
sequence where you learn how to do it, and then the kind of
Right.
elevated, more complex sequence later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wonder if there's like an analogy to that in literature or something, of a kind of affordance or withholding or overuse
Hmm.
or somewhere else.
It would be like if Tristram Shandy had two black pages.
I've never read Tristram Shandy, so I don't know.
There's this
But there's
front,
a black page.
yeah, when a character dies, there's famously a page that's just black.
Oh, interesting. And
And the kind of like Sony and Santa Monica or Ubisoft approach would be to have a black page every like 30
right,
pages.
right, right, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, interesting.
So Eric, are you working on anything right now?
Um, yeah. Gosh, I've got three articles out. I just finished expanding what you saw a few pages of on like the dioramic quality character of game spaces. I was talking about Kentucky Route Zero a bit. There's a lot of cabin games for some reason lately, kind of escape room style games that seems to be putting pressure on. I don't know if games had kind of ballooned outward in terms of open space, they've kind of like there's this collapse or something, and now we're games. A lot of games are fixated on this like inside outside, four walls. The movement is kind of gridded in weird ways, but um, that's the latest thing. I had something else about that like that kinetic sense or that sense of like extending your will into game space. Now this all feels like things we could have talked about, but would Mark J.P. Wolf has this phrase that he got from a art historian, where he says this will to activity, and he says when you play a game, you sort of extend your will into game space, and yeah, I mean once I finish an article, I kind of want to take a break and do anything else, I guess. But I'm working on a book review now, so I'm trying to get back into that. And then at Jigger at the conference, I'm just another thing that would have I thought about talking about for a second was as a good example of something you were saying earlier. There's a this game called Freedom that was made by the developers of Oregon Trail. I don't know if you've heard of it, but um, it's fascinating. There's a Vice article about it. You play as an escaped illiterate slave in the antebellum South, and your character can't read. And what's so interesting is that there's this moment where you encounter a sign on which something is written, and it's this gibberish script when you see it in the game. And that's supposed to be like a representation of illiteracy or something. But of course, that sign actually has English written on it. Your character just can't read. But I can read presumably as the player, so I'm sort of forced to be unable to read too by just being given a text which is not actually legible at all, something that can be read. So there's two objects, really strangely, that refer to one thing. There's a sign with English written on it that an illiterate person can't read. There's this other object which is gibberish, and how you reconcile the two. It's very strange. And so that's what I'm presenting on at the conference, kind of active reading in games, or like this possibility that your character could know something that a player doesn't know, or vice versa, which I think is really odd. Where you know, role playing games where your character is an amnesiac, it's like from now on we're both going to know the same things because we'll encounter them at the same time. And where this sort of breaks down is quite interesting. This guy Olive Tapiolino, he talks about like the flashbang device in say like Counter-Strike or Far Cry, where it goes off and your screen goes white and there's like a buzzing sound. It's like that's a representation of your being blinded by a flash grenade, but like I'm looking at my own blindness as someone who plays the game as like a sighted person. This is again, these contradictions in terms of like my character's blind and I'm looking at them being blind, or I have to believe in their own experience, which is, you know, I have to kind of make believe in their make believe or something. Strange stuff. But yeah, what are you working on? You're working on your book or
Yes.
edits rather.
Yeah, I'm doing revisions on an academic book on the
Cool.
modern. And honestly, that's about it. I don't have I have another book that I published a part of it on Death Stranding. Death Stranding's a
Mm.
thesis, example, this spring, and that that's on the horizon.
Cool.
I've been Brian. I don't know if we've even talked about this, but I've been working on sort of preliminary sort of notes on a book about Magic the Gathering, the card game.
Hmm.
Oh,
So yeah, so that's something, maybe that's material for a later episode.
Very
But
cool.
no, I think it's all like it's kind of I've gone through several years now where I had like four, major projects and a bunch of side pieces all going at
Hmm.
once. And now it's like basically the decks are completely cleared and I just have the
Hmm.
one book that I need to finish this summer. And then we'll see where we go.
That's great. That is to feel good.
And Brian just had a book come out too.
mhm.
And yeah, you always have tons of projects. So
Yeah, probably too
I,
many. Yeah.
I think what was your book called? I thought I just looked it up a second ago. Saw it.
It's called Four Moments of Aesthetic
Yeah,
Experience. Yeah. So
cool.
that just came out, and the other major thing is I have I mean, I'm planning a second book project, but right now I'm heading into editing or co-editing a book on Proust called Quiet
Hmm.
Proust, which has a
Hmm.
contract with Bloomsbury. So I'm working on that
Oh,
one
awesome.
with James
Very
Dutton.
cool.
So yeah,
Super.
that's the next big thing, I guess. Yeah.
and
Great.
Eric, where can people find you? If you
Where
want to be
can
found, maybe you don't want to be found, which is totally valid.
Sure. Yeah, I mean I'm on Google Scholar and ResearchGate. I also just have a link tree that's under my name, Erick Verran, and I put like reviews, poetry, and the articles. I kind of throw them all together there. But like ResearchGate or Google Scholar works for articles. Um, yeah, hopefully something's coming. Nothing's coming out yet. I'm in the very lonely stage of waiting for reviewers to get back to me in many months. But this was
Fantastic.
really fun, and thanks for having me on. Thanks for making space for this. It's great.
Of course, thanks so much. It was really, really a pleasure to chat. And I really like your work. I think I speak for Brian too. Like we both really like your work. So we're really grateful that you made the time to come on.
Yeah, no, likewise, absolutely.